Welcome to the Affirming Village podcast, where we center neurodivergent voices, affirm diverse ways of being, and empower families, educators, and advocates with knowledge that truly honors the whole learner. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff, a late diagnosed autistic ADHD mental health therapist and non-attorney special education advocate, and Lisa Baskin-Wright, an ADHD and dyslexic educator and IEP coach. Together, we dig into conversations about neuroaffirming practices, special education, and disability rights. Please remember, nothing shared on this podcast is medical or legal advice, and the views shared here by the host and the guest are their personal opinions. This space is for educational purposes only, to help you feel informed, empowered, and never alone in the village. Welcome back to the Affirming Village podcast, and today we're taking a moment to wrap up this school year.
And not just talk about, how it went, but also how we transition to summer and wrap things up. Because for a lot of families, the end of the school year isn't just a finish line, it's a moment where everything kind of catches up to you.
The wins, the hard moments, the things that you take into summer, and the things that you want to leave behind.
And when you're parenting and advocating for a neurodivergent learner, a school year takes a lot out of you, and there are a lot of moving parts to manage.
Yes, it's meetings, emails, pushing, adjusting, holding your learner and yourself, feeling that some progress has transpired in preparation for the following year. So today we're talking about how to intentionally wrap up the school year.
Yeah, what it looks like to close this chapter without ignoring what it held, while simultaneously setting up the transition for the upcoming school year with intention.
Because while capacity is part of the work too, it's not until we finally slow down that we can truly reflect on the past year.
So if you're listening and you're tired or still holding on to this year, this conversation is for you. So let's get into it. Like if you're holding one eye open with your finger, welcome. The water is warm.
Taking deep breaths to try and regulate.
Right.
This is for you.
Exactly. If you're cracking terrible jokes and making Destiny almost pee her pants right before you hit record, this conversation is for you.
Oh my goodness. So welcome to the last episode of season 1 of the Affirming Village podcast.
Woo-hoo!
Now, we ended up doing what I think 12 more episodes than we intended on doing originally, wasn't it? Weren't we gonna do we were gonna do 6 and 6, and then it transpired to 10, and then it went to 12, and then now we have
a
24 episode season.
Yeah,
so
I feel like we were gonna start with 10.
Were we gonna start with 10? Okay.
I don't remember.
No, I think we were gonna do 5 and 5 and 5.
I think we were. Whatever we did a lot more.
Yeah.
Go us.
Yeah.
And go you for listening to us.
Thank you for listening to us and joining us on this crazy ADHD road, because we get really sidetracked. Like now. But no, but we really wanted the last episode of the first season to be a wrap up of the year, but also looking at how to practically and, for a better lack of words, comfortably or successfully wrap up the school year. Because we know that depending on what state you're in, you're heading into the end of the school year, you're heading into your annual IEP meeting or your end of the school year IEP meeting. And we just want to make sure that you have some practical tips and also kind of, recap some of the things that led to the end of the school year, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, we wanted this episode to kind of both hold space for kind of the emotional roller coaster ride that a school year can be, while also providing some kind of like practical insight of things that could be done before the end of the school year to help ease that transition into the next year.
Yeah, absolutely. I know, kind of diving right into that practicality piece. A lot of times, and Lisa and I have talked about this a lot on the podcast and in our, our social media content with our families. A lot of times, parents and school teams kind of operate off that one IEP meeting a year standpoint,
Right,
right? Like,
right.
and they feel like, oh, if we're requesting outside of that annual, then something's wrong. And I kind of want to like reframe that, because for me as a parent, one of the things that I found was very effective and which is very interesting is for my kids, um, their annual used to be at the end of the school year. And then when we moved, it switched due to the reevaluation and the new team's evaluation of their needs to the beginning. And so I've always had that dance when I was initially learning about special education and how there's one annual IEP meeting of like,
Sure.
okay, so I'm just not supposed to talk about anything after we meet in August or September. And then it's like, or I'm just supposed to not have any issues after we've met in April or May and we come back in August and September.
Right, right.
And
Goes both ways. Hmm.
yeah, and so I kind of realized early on as a parent that didn't work for me. Like,
Right.
I wanted to have conversations with the team. I wanted to discuss what worked, what didn't, and all those pieces. So, that's something I now have recommend my parents and my families do. So, one thing I recommend is that it's very important if your child's annual is at the beginning of the school year, the beginning half of the school year, even if it's in like January or February, that in that March, April, or May or June timeframe, that you hold a meeting to discuss how does this support look for next school year? How does this support translate into this next grade? Now, I always say absolutely at the top of that is if your learner is going from pre-K to kinder, from elementary to middle, or middle to high school, you absolutely want to hold those meetings to see like how does it translate into this new setting, this new environment. But I've also found that it's really effective just for the next grade,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Is there now going to be more expectation? Is there now going to be more academic demands? Is there now going to be switching of classes? That was something we had to talk about with my son. They're starting them in elementary around now it's third, but it was originally fourth and fifth grade to prepare them for middle school. And so that was something where it's like, okay, if you have a learner that struggles with transition, are we going to need extra support when we're transitioning from these different classrooms? And now instead of me just dealing with a third grade gen ed teacher and a special ed teacher, I'm now dealing with three gen ed teachers and a
Right.
special ed teacher, right?
Right.
And
Looks different.
so one of my practical tips and steps I would recommend is holding that meeting so you can discuss what's gone well and what are concerns. I found that that's been very helpful too, especially when you have a collaborative team, excuse me, they're able to say like, hey, this is something that I do naturally in third grade. Like we do this for all third graders. They're not doing that in fourth grade. So we need to add that as an accommodation so they get access to that. So that's definitely a tip I wanted to throw out there.
Yeah, and you've got me thinking, back in the day when my daughter was younger, and it could have just been the district we were in and the timing of her annual meeting, which was later in the school year. Often, not always, but often there would be, I'm thinking more in the earlier years, there would be a teacher from the next grade in that meeting in the spring, that transition meeting. And I know for sure, like, I've got a family that's like in my head, I'm thinking of where we asked for like an increase in support for this current school year. And while they're not making one of those transitions between sort of levels, right? Like it's not a pre-K to kinder and et cetera. It's within an elementary school transition. Um, it's a significant transition within elementary school, right? And so I did suggest to the team when we met, I think it was the beginning of March, hey, why don't we implement this new change? Let's see how it goes in the current classroom with the current teacher who happens to be quite lovely and highly attuned and who strongly advocated for the increase in support, which is lovely. And I'm like, and then let's hold a meeting. Let's hold a transition meeting later in the school year and let's invite a teacher. It doesn't have to necessarily be the teacher of record because classroom assignments and all that stuff haven't necessarily happened. But let's bring somebody in who's sort of the expert in terms of grade level content and the flow of the next year, those kinds of expectations, etc. Let's have that person come in the room so they can not only learn more about the student, but also share with the team sort of what typical life looks like at this grade level, what's the difference between the previous year and the current year and what to expect for next year, and really be a part of that conversation. And what it also can do is if you bring somebody into that conversation, obviously it's not a guarantee, but like more often than not, that does end up being the teacher of record because they've been part of that collaboration and part of that conversation. And so it just makes sense that they're kind of somewhat caught up to speed and they've already been a part of some of those decisions to then say, okay, you've started to establish a relationship with the family, et cetera. Let's put this learner, in your class. But I think that that piece can be really, really helpful as well.
Yeah, and when you were talking, you made me think about how like a theme I've noticed this year, and I know you and I have had this conversation, and it's been more prevalent to me this year than in my previous years of advocacy, is that shift from K through second to three through fifth, third through fifth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I noticed this year some of my learners and some of the families that were coming to me a theme of now we're not learning to learn, right? We're implementing what we've learned.
Right,
And
right.
that's when we're seeing more barriers that were not always recognizable due to, maybe behavior is one thing I've seen, whereas a lot of dysregulation. And so we're not seeing that there's also foundational academic skills missing there for the learner. Or we've seen where the teacher was amazing and, like you mentioned, attuned and implementing. My youngest son had a teacher that for all her students, she did a multi-sensory approach for academics. Like whenever they did letters and numbers, they did sand and they did Play-Doh, and that's
Right.
naturally what she did, right? And so then when they're going up and it's like we have testing, right? Because I think that's the biggest shift I've seen for that K through second going to third through fifth. It's not
Sure.
anything against, our third, fourth, fifth grade teachers because um my son's third grade teacher was amazing. My son's fourth grade teachers have been amazing. But it's just the rigor and that
Sure.
they're having to prepare them for state testing. And so because of that, you see some of that kind of flexibility leave. And you'll see, I mean, I've had teachers that are like, this is the study guide, and I don't even really feel like this lines up with the lesson, but this is our state, this is the
Right.
criteria.
They're like,
And they're
here we
like,
go.
so unfortunately, this is what I'm sending home, right? And so that takes the flexibility, I think, from them too. And so then the
Totally.
learner is struggling because everyone's trying to figure out how to have that flexibility to provide that support. So one of the themes I did notice as we're talking into like wrapping up the year is like a struggle for my learners going from second to third grade.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I've seen it at multiple ages, but yes, that is a key kind of pivotal transition. We're sort of like teams have described this as like we're pivoting from learning to read to reading to learn, right? Um, One of the things that you said, and it triggered my brain of because it came up during I run like a parents group community, and Destiny's part of it on Friday mornings, and we're recording on Friday, well, late afternoon for me, evening for Destiny. um, is this idea around accommodations. And I can't remember, neither one of us could remember this morning. So I'm just going to say it again if we talked about this during our accommodations episode. But there are some teachers who, and some schools that just sort of have it set up that there are certain accommodations that are just sort of part of like what's offered within the general education classroom. And so sometimes you'll be in an IEP meeting and it's like, oh, well, all learners get access to a Chromebook or all learners get access to math manipulatives or whatever it may be, right? All learners can drink water in my class if they need to, or press pause, or there's, kind of a little sensory kind of quiet area in the classroom. All learners are allowed to access, right? So there's no reason to put it in the IEP because that's something that all learners can access. And the difference here is that for a learner who has an IEP or a 504, those accommodations are necessary to remove barriers to access. And so that's wonderful and lovely. And thank you for being so thoughtful in the design of your classroom. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the same thing in next year's class. And this learner is needing those accommodations because there are barriers to their accessing the learning environment. And so it has to be codified in the IEP. And so this idea of having kind of a conversation later in the year, especially bringing in somebody from kind of the next grade to join that conversation, is they can speak with more authority to, oh, yeah, you know what? In my classroom, we don't have the space for that kind of quiet area set up. So we're going to have to really be differently thoughtful about like sensory breaks or movement breaks for this learner because I don't have that accommodation in my classroom. Or, I have a particular aversion to eating in my classroom, so I don't allow students to eat in my classroom. So if this young person needs to be able to access snacks or nutrition at sort of alternative times during the day, we're going to have to come up with a plan for that, or whatever it may be. Um, there's certain manipulatives or learning tools that are presented when we're sort of building foundational skills, but they get scaffolded back in those later years, but some learners still need those tools in order to be able to access the learning, right? So um, I don't want to beat the horse dead, but like I just think it's really important to have these kinds of conversations, and it doesn't have to reach a boiling point or a breaking point in order to ask for an IEP. This is just sort of general advice, but like, especially at that transition. The other thing too that I think can be really helpful is kind of foreshadowing and having a conversation around what does the actual transition into the next year look like? Can this young person access the classroom a day or two before, see where they're going to be, meet the teachers, reconnect with the related service providers, sort of, if it's a transition to, like I'm thinking of middle school from elementary to middle, like a lot of schools sort of have things built in, like they'll have like a kinder like orientation for lack of a better word, right? Like but those times aren't necessarily accessible for our learners, right? And so we need to come up with a literal transition plan for them and what that looks like, and that needs to be codified in the IEP too.
Yeah, I had two thoughts that came to mind when you were talking about that. The first one, when you were talking about like like kind of like that, this is what we do, right? And we know that certain things are like grade level. Like this is what they do. Like there are certain things in kindergarten that just they do. But I just had that conversation in a meeting the other day where it was like, well, that's, standard for all teachers. And I was like, I'm so sorry. I'm like, but I'm just gonna have to sit here and say we know that all teachers are not created equal. And what's funny is that as I'm saying this, the teacher's actively going, mm-hmm. Like, like all teachers are not created equal. And I was like, and all teachers are not doing
No,
all the things that they're trained and that's they're supposed to be doing.
no,
And I was like,
unfortunately.
and to anyone that's listening to this, it's like, me and my dad have this conversation often where it's like every profession has someone that is not good in the profession at what they're doing. It has
Right.
nothing
There's
to
terrible
do with,
advocates.
yeah, like you're not a saint because of the role you've taken on. You're not above, you're not doing all the things and blah, blah, blah. But I'm not going to get on that soapbox. But
We did
I
that on
had
the
to say
last
that
episode.
because somebody's gonna take that and run with it and be like, she said all educators. And no, I did not. So don't play with me. And so, but I have to say, like, no, I'm sorry. Like, that's actually not true. And we know that all educators are not doing that. And we know that da 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 da, right? So that was the first thought I had about when you were talking about the accommodations, kind of that standard party line they try and throw out there of like, oh, that's what we do for everybody. And I'm like, okay, cool, then it shouldn't be a problem, put it on paper, right? And then
Right.
like, because you do it anyway, so you're just documenting what you do. um which, by the way, is another way I do approach that topic, and just kind of like, and I always just say, like, a lot teachers often do stuff which is true that is not documented on paper, because that is just how they run their classroom, or that is
Sure.
just how they operate. But we need that same thing implemented for our learners, and so, making sure to do that. And then the other thing, when you had mentioned, I feel like I talked too much and I lost what it was.
I would try to jog your memory, but I don't remember what I said.
Oh my goodness. Okay, we're talking about them accessing it, and you mentioned something about a meeting, you don't have to have a meeting just because.
Oh, we were talking, you had mentioned earlier that like it doesn't have to be because there's a problem or you've hit like a snafu or you're at a
Right,
breaking
right, right.
point, that like having a meeting to like get on the same page about a goal or to, right? Like it's not limited to this time of year to be able to come together and say, hey, what does this look like? Do we need to make some fine tunement,
Oh,
attunement,
that's
whatever?
what it is. It wasn't anything to do with that. It was because
I'm
you
here
had
to help.
mentioned about how they could have something for learners, like what does it look like the actual transition next year? Like, what does it look
Ah,
like for them to actually access the setting?
yeah,
Because we have like these open houses, which can be very overwhelming. And it always makes me
right.
think about, for my oldest son, so there had been almost like a separation. The first year we had went to the school we're at now, when we had moved, both of my children started out in gen ed full time. They had to determine what's their least restrictive environment, and they were checking the box like they were supposed to, because I immediately came in like, this is where they need to go. But I also understood like they have to make sure they're doing their due diligence. And so, because of that, when we did open house, my kids were on the list and everything. And it was like, go to this teacher, they had a desk, they had a thing, meet the teacher, do all that. Well, where we're at, they have like if their homeroom is their, so let's say, self-contained room, right? Then it's such a small group of learners that they don't necessarily put the list out there for everyone to see, but they do that for the gen ed. And so what ended up happening, though, was my son thought that I hadn't registered him for school, and was like, did you forget? And then he wasn't able to access. And so when we're looking at kind of that transition and that preparation, one of the things I did was, I, of course, y'all know me by now, I followed up with an email and was like, this is unacceptable, because it caused such dysregulation and distress, not just for him, but for me. Our youngest was just distressed at the fact that he was leaving his teacher that he loved. And in his case, what had happened was he was going up to the next grade, but his special education teacher had got a job at the district level in
Right.
another district. So it was like two losses and two grieves, things to grieve. And so open house was a nightmare for us. And so one of the things that I think when you mentioned that triggered that for me is that importance of navigating that transition of preparation. That was the first time where I had taken my kids to an open house, and like their name wasn't on a paper. We didn't know where we were going. And so I thought the year before, right, we'd navigated this. So we knew how this school does their open house. And so we know
Right.
what to do. And not seeing that really disrupted us and threw us off. And so I think it's not just about, when you're looking at that next year, it's asking, right, about that transition. I know we've had several people in community too who have mentioned, not disclosing anything confidentially, but they just mentioned like having conversations with other parents and coming together and, talking to the district to get something put together specifically for special education learners, for open house. And I think that's amazing. But also on the parent side, just kind of prepping more. And I will say that I don't think that I really prepped because that one experience had made me think this is how this goes. And
Sure, of
I hadn't
course.
factored in those other pieces. And I think sometimes as parents, that happens for us, right? Where we're like, okay, and especially me being autistic, it was kind of like, okay, this is how they do it. So this is how it goes. And so then I was
Right.
really thrown into dysregulation. And my husband actually at a point was like, let's just go. Let's just regulate. Let's just, you know what I mean? Because he was like, I can
Yeah.
clearly see the dysregulation rising. I can see the upset. Like everybody was off kilter, and he's trying to, be the one to keep us calm in the storm. And then he's like, I'm going to get
Us
dysregulated
ADHDers
too.
are really good at that.
So I think like it's really looking at that piece too of just like, what can you do, to kind of prep, and what questions do you have? And I think that's something that I think is great too, of like asking, just like, so for open house, like what does that look like, and what is this going to look like, and when are we going to find out this or do that? I think that would be
Yeah.
practical too.
Yeah. Two things. One, I was only half kidding. I actually think us ADHDers are very good in those kinds of moments. Number one. And number two, I remember those voice messages and I was really glad that you guys recognized what was going on and were like, we're out. And I thought you managed that advocacy really well. It's also making me think that, so Destiny and I, well, I'll just let the little cat out of the bag. We're going to do a truncated like summer season. We will definitely be kind of diving into this a little bit more during that, somewhere during that summer session. Um, of ways to kind of prepare once school started, like ways to initiate that kind of communication and set up collaboration and all the things. But that work, I'm going to call it work, that work, those conversations can start now. But are you okay if I like pivot us towards like the emotional side of things? So one of the things, I'm just going to name it, and I think I talked about it maybe on social media, I don't know, is I feel like there's like a pattern that can happen for families who have learners on IEPs and 504s as well. But I see it, well, I'm not even say that because I see it in both situations for different reasons, where it can feel like you're losing time, right? That the year's been really hard. We haven't reached resolution. Like the thing isn't thinging, right? Like we haven't figured out the thing yet. And I think there's fear involved in that. I think there's grief involved in that. I think there's frustration and anger, if not rage, all fair, right? But I think that's something that it's really hard to kind of show up in a collaborative spirit to like wrap the year up and put a bow on it while we're like trying to gently carry the package to next year, right? When we're feeling like things have really gone sideways, our learners haven't accessed school in meaningful ways or in as meaningful ways as we would hope for. We talked about this on one of the previous episodes where like this is a chasm I think that happens for a lot of families, is that there are a good amount of teams where like the IEP meeting itself feels productive. I think it was the implementation with Fidelity episode. But when it's time for rubber to meet the road, it just doesn't happen in the way that we've sort of conceptualized during the meeting. And I think that's a scenario that can be incredibly frustrating and disheartening and just like almost disillusioning. Like why am I participating in this? Why am I showing up when nothing ever changes and nothing ever happens? Like um but there's another scenario. I mean, there's probably infinite number of scenarios, but there's another scenario I'm thinking of, which is teams that just skirt issues. We're going to stick a pin in that. We're going to come back to that. We're going to stick a pin in that. And then like they forget to take out the pin and like have the conversation, right? I think that there are so many moving parts. I do think that like our schools aren't adequately staffed. I don't think the infrastructure is there more universally. Obviously, there's varying degrees of this in individual school sites. But staff are holding a lot and families are holding a lot. And unfortunately, like for lack of a better way of putting it, like balls get dropped. And so it feels really crummy to feel like the conversation is never done, that the decision is never made, right? Like I had a meeting with a family, they're so lovely, the other day, and their learner's been on a 504 for multiple years, and it's like, la la la, there's nothing to see here, right? And so finally it was like, enough is enough is enough. Our child needs an IEP, right? So we go through the evaluation process. This young person was found eligible back in February, but we didn't finish the conversation. They didn't ever send a draft copy of the IEP because we're not there yet. We're going to come back together and meet. So we come back together. They had one goal. I'm like, this is some bullshit. We had front loaded the team with like 5 proposed goals. The meeting ended up going sideways. This was the meeting where the district administrator said to me, Lisa, it seems like you're in your feels. Because the teacher had, God love her, had like derailed things and blah, blah, blah. So again, no draft was ever like really proposed. Nothing ever came through SACE. Nothing was ever given to the family, like sign this so that you can at least sign with exceptions so that we can begin. Nothing. They're like, let's have a 504 meeting. I'm like, why the fuck are we having a 504 meeting? She was found eligible for special education 2 months ago. What are we doing? We finally, they got this learner at a different school. We finally have the freaking meeting this last week. So we are recording on Friday, May 1st. This last week, we finally have the meeting. We finally get it buttoned up. And the parent had said to me, because it was just the 15th anniversary of my daughter being found eligible for special education, and I put out a reel where I was talking about the only time I ever said anything ever about our journey was 15 years ago on that day, and all it said was finally ... Like I totally beg booked. But I was like too afraid to say whatever. And the parent said to me the night of this meeting, where like finally everything was buttoned up, she's like, all I can think about is your post. And she wrote finally ... Right? Like years of trauma and being ignored and her child not being seen. And right? Like it is so much to hold. And even at that meeting, like the new team for the most part was really, really good, but there was a couple of naysayers in the room, and I'm like, please stop talking. Thankfully, the case manager was phenomenal, and like the most sort of important players were all spectacular, but there were some periphery folks where I was just like, you need to stop talking because I'm gonna show up right back in my feels. Just ask the director. She knows how that story goes.
I can't even, and and Lisa is saying that because she told me when that was said to her, and I still stand by what I said. I can't even imagine if that had been said to me. I think, like, I don't know what my reaction would have been, but I don't know, that would have been kind. So I'm glad that I did not experience that
Mine
because
wasn't great. I will
I
own
mean,
that.
you're very good with like at least and I have talked about this. We are very good in our own ways with handling certain things. Like certain things that I handle with tact, she struggles to handle with tact. Certain things that she struggles to handle with tact, I handle well with tact. And
Right.
so it's like, and I think that's
I'm
that is
so
the balance
impressed
of
when you
it.
handle things with tact that all I want to do is scream 4-letter words. And Destiny's just like boop 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 bink bong. And I'm like, how did you do that? And then there's the reverse of that is probably also true. But like, I'm always
Yes.
just so impressed when I'm like, oh, how did she find the words to communicate? Set the boundary, do the thing.
Because
I'm
some
like,
things
yes.
like, and I think anyone listening to this can feel like that. Like some things, and this is what I would say. Like some things, when I do trainings with staff, I'm like, some things are going to be a non-starter for you. Some things are a trigger for you, and you have to recognize they are a trigger.
Yeah.
so that you don't dysregulate yourself and cause further dysregulation in the person.
Right.
And I think when you're talking about like, those things finally happening, right, for that parent and kind of that emotional piece, I think it can be, the school year can be very topsy-turvy too when on the good side of when like you finally get the thing.
Right.
But then on the other side when you get it on paper
Right.
and there's a lack of implementation, or things have been going really well and a new barrier to access pops up. And I want to be clear, when I'm referring to this, it doesn't mean it's a person. It could
Right.
be something academically or educationally that your learner had not yet had to encounter.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
now they are, because of not just the grade, but I've seen where states and districts like implement new things. And all of a sudden, the teachers are having to teach this new thing, and they're struggling to teach the new thing in this new curriculum. And then the
Yeah.
learner is like struggling to receive it, but because it's new for them, they're like, I don't even know how to adapt this to
Right.
accommodate them. I would,
Fair.
but and I've seen that so many times where teachers have said, like, I don't even like this curriculum. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, they're like, I don't even like it. And they were like, and I don't think it's easier and I don't think it's better, right? And they're like, but this has now become like a statewide requirement. And so now this is what we have to do. And that always goes back to, not to hop on my soapbox, but that always goes back to the people making the decisions that don't actually have to put it into practice or implement
Right. I was going to say, I could climb right back up on my soapbox
it.
because apparently I'm doing that today and talk about like teacher autonomy and like the ability to make decisions for your learners in your classroom. Like, sorry, my dog, of course, is shaking. She was snoring, which is why I muted myself a second ago, but now she's arisen. Um, yeah, we could go down that rabbit hole and talk about how we don't treat teachers as the professionals that they are and allow them to make decisions and have some autonomy around curriculum. And, my teaching experience was very, very unique in that we took the textbook, chucked it out the window, and wrote all of our own curriculum. So my background is unique. I will own that.
But I mean, that's, and so when we talk about that emotional piece too, it's like when things all of a sudden switch up, when you have a new hurdle. Um, I've had families that, you know, suspect their learner is dyslexic, and then they get testing and find out they are. And now, like, how do we catch up? How do we now support them? And they're heading into third grade. And so it's like now we're reading to learn, we're not learning to read.
Right.
And so, what are the hurdles and concerns and barriers there? And so, I
Right.
think that emotional piece too is that it's never, to me, it's never just a smooth, consistent ride to me. And I'm still, like I always express, I'm still very young in the parent special education piece too, of that. Like, my kids are still in elementary school.
Right.
But I've had the opportunity though to support families from pre-K all the way up to my first senior graduates this year. It was super
It's always
exciting.
so exciting.
It is, and she's doing phenomenal. And we already had her last IEP meeting, and she's an amazing setup and great support around her and great transition plan and all the things. Um, but to me, it is really a roller coaster because it's not just looking at what your learner needs to access. It's looking at the setting. It's looking at the teacher. It's looking at the curriculum. It's, there's so many pieces that we have to consider. And I think for me personally, as a parent, each summer brings a relaxation, which I know is not the same for all parents. And I want to state that
Sure.
my learners being out on break is very chill. And I understand that is not everyone else's situation, especially if, like, my husband and I, we work from home. And so because of that, um, we don't necessarily have to find care, and our jobs do allow us to, they're old enough to where they can do things, and then we have family nearby. So I want to be upfront when I say that, because I know for some parents, kids being out of school is stressful and it throws them off their routine, and it
Sure.
disrupts their nervous system, and it's very dysregulating. But for us, summer and spring break and winter break, and we don't have fall break, but we get Thanksgiving and we get that few days out, is a decompression of, like, not having to worry or be concerned, or did you get enough sleep, how are you when you got up, when you did this and that. And
Right.
it's the opposite. As the new year comes, we find our anxiety spiking back up, and we find ourselves like, okay, how are they seeming about school, and how are they feeling, and are they feeling ready, and what is going to be
Right.
our new routine. And so I think that's the piece I want to point out on the emotional side. It's just like, depending on what it's like in your home, right? Like, it's very much a roller coaster um throughout the journey, and that things can change depending on the loss of a para, leaving the district, or a teacher change, or my son's teacher went on maternity leave this year.
Mm. Sure.
And we thankfully did not have struggles, because she had a sub that every time she was out subbed for her, the same sub. And that
Oh,
sub
that's nice.
took over her class when she was out on maternity leave. And it was done intentionally as to not disrupt the transition. So the kids already knew the teacher that was coming in for her when she went out on maternity leave, which was great, because she actually ended up having to go out earlier than she intended, and was
Right.
out
These things
longer
happen.
than she intended. But it was not an issue, because the kids knew the long-term sub. And so,
Sure.
like, that's an
Sure.
example, though, of something that, like, you can't, as parents, plan for that, even though your child struggles with that transition,
Right.
their routine and schedule being disrupted.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. No, I think you lift up a really important point, which is, time away from school, changes in schedule, all of those things, even weekends, right? For some families, are respite and recovery and, really necessary. Right? Where, I mean, like, in full transparency, Destiny and I, like, almost on the daily are like, is it summer break yet? Like, we're tired, right? But for other families, that is not true at all, right? The routine, the break, right? The structure, the services, right? All of those things, the financial impact of, like, having to get care in, and right? Like, I could go political easily with what's happening, trying to strip away funding for caregivers and, right, like, all the things. I'm gonna,
Bullshit.
it's
That is such complete and utter ableist, racist, sexist
eugenics.
bullshit.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Without breaking any kind of confidentiality, I've had multiple meetings with families I support who are close to, if not in a full panic.
Mhm.
It's
Absolutely.
right. It's just absolutely despicable. So,
Mhm.
um, and that's not to say that folks who are in those kinds of circumstances that don't have the same kind of privilege and access to family and access to support networks and all of those things, that their learners don't need respite and recovery, and right, like, it's not all one thing or the other. We're trying to manage a million different systems. um but for some learners, like, school really provides, like, so much. And that's not to disparage what's happening at home, but, like, that routine, that knowing what to do, right? That um, s- structured time is really, really, really helpful. And the absence of that can be really, really, really hard. And like extended school year often isn't at the site with the staff that the learner is used to, right? It's like, oh, we do elementary ESY over at, Wright Elementary School, except your learner goes to Huff Elementary School. So, and, the teachers from Huff Elementary won't be at Wright Elementary for ESY. So, right, like all those different things to consider. It's usually what, 4, 5, maybe 6 weeks, if that, not typically quite that long. It's partial day, right? That also informs care, transportate, right? Like all the things. So anyway, I just wanted folks to feel like we see you in that, like, this isn't just a clean, yay, it's almost summer and there's nothing to think about. And like, I'm just going to flush this year and move on, right? Like, we really want you to feel seen and well held in this space, that we understand the unevenness of what school can feel like, the like, I need this and I need it to work, and the I'm freaking exhausted and right, like, where's the eject button? How do I get out of here? Right? Like all of the things happening at the same time. And I'm so fucking tired. Why do I have to think about next year? And yet, if I don't think about next year, that transition and that sort of taking care of mental health of the learner also applies to the parents, right? Like, as exhausted as we are, if we don't start to put some things in motion, that panic will feel bigger for us too. And then, of course, our children feed off of that energy. And I don't mean that as like a blame thing. Our children tend to be highly, highly attuned.
No, 100%. And you made me think of when, like we were talking about ESY, like I remember my oldest did it 1 year, and we thankfully had the opportunity where, like, I think it was like his counselor, but also several staff from his school that hadn't been with him in his grade, but had been at his school and interacted with him, were going to be at the location for the ESY. So it wasn't going to be at his school, but the location that they were going to be there, and they were going to be able to interact and engage with him. And so there were some familiar faces for him. But the other side too, when you're talking about like that financial piece, like when we did that, we had our kids in a summer camp that was where their after school program was. And the thing for us was that the ESY went from 8:30 to 12:30, Monday through Thursday. But for summer camp, that doesn't matter. Like, if you want him to come here after ESY, you have to pay for the week. And so we were literally paying for him to come, like, 4 times 4, 16 plus 8, 24 hours of the week. But we were paying for like a 40-hour, right?
Right.
Like, and summer camp was more expensive because they had field trips,
Of
and they had,
course.
like,
Of
they're
course.
feeding them for lunch and breakfast and snack, even if your child's not there for right? And so it's like summer is not always, and again, that's why me and my husband like working from home. We recognize that piece too, but we've done the whole gambit of, working outside the home and finding care and being away from family and then being near family, or only being able to, thankfully, but only being able to have family get them like a spring break, or because we pay for care year round and we get like 2 weeks free, like that's built in there where you can like not pay, and they can't come that whole week though, so you better make sure that you're going to have them with like that whole week,
Right.
because you can't turn around and go, oh, my parent got sick, and so like their grandparent got sick and they can't watch them, and it's like, okay, well, I guess they're going to be at home for 2 days because you can't. And so we've done that whole gambit, and I think, um like you said, it's just important to look at that emotional piece and just acknowledge that there's different levels to it for different families. And I have families as well that they are like, whew, it's break. And then I have families that are like, whew, it's break. And sometimes
Right.
it's navigating that change in routine and schedule from not being in school. Sometimes it's the transition back, right? Because I think we're always thinking about, unfortunately, we always have to think about what that looks like because we're not always with supportive teams. We're not always with supportive schools. We're not always with supportive administration, collaborative, caring, you know, individuals that understand, oh, we're transitioning back from a break. Oh, we're transitioning back from being out for whatever reason. And so I think another thing, like a kind of practical point too, would be, how does your learner transition back? I know for my family, for a while, our oldest, that was a struggle. Like winter, summer, spring break, after Thanksgiving, it was like, okay, we gotta like low demand, decrease demands, decrease pressure, more breaks, like, and after a while, it with OT and collaborating and putting proactive things in place. And I want to make that clear. It wasn't just like magically one day he got up and all of a sudden was like, oh, it's fine to go back. We did all these things and worked together and put all these things in place to where there's more, I think, enjoyment during break now, less anxiety about going back unless there's like testing. He's actually relaxing and enjoying, and he might say like, "Oh, I really wish that we had more days like anyone else." You know what I mean? Because he's still human.
Fair
And
enough.
me and Dad are like, "Yeah, us too," but we're we're not seeing that transition, due to having to mask. I really think it was having to mask and not having regulation internally, but feeling regulated in the environment. And so you want to look at what are some ways to proactively plan. And some of the things I've seen with some of my families that has worked is really front loading with like visual schedules and stories, and not visual schedules, but visuals of like, this is what the classroom would look like, and this is what this is going to look like. And, once they know the teacher, this is what the teacher looks like. And just kind of helping that learner prepare for that mentally. And then the other piece you have to do too is like if it's the academic side, right? Because some parents, the learner is recognizing that there's those barriers and things they're struggling to access. And so they've heard about, right? Especially if you have a younger sibling and they have an older sibling, they've heard about what comes next. And so they're nervous about, can I
Sure.
do that? And now they've got that running through their mind. And having those type of conversations and talking about the plans and supports in place for the learner.
Yeah. No, absolutely. You said something earlier and I had a thought and it decided to disappear because that's apparently how my brain works. But um I was thinking of a way to like wrap up and I was thinking about that this summer when we talk about this that we'll kind of take a deeper dive into that sort of preparing for that transition back. And I had a thought that was potentially really profound, Destiny, but it is like gone. So we're not getting anything earth-shattering, apparently. Because they're
You know
really
what it is?
thoughtful,
It's cause we're
insightful.
it's cause we're like we're fading.
Yeah.
Um because I mean no, because it's been, again, we're talking about this year and that, I think I like to think we're pretty transparent. Um I mean, I would say more than I have in the past. I've definitely had more part twos or part threes or even extended part twos than previously, where districts are literally, which for some of my parents, I want to be clear, for some of my parents, that 1 hour meeting really works for their capacity, depending on the amount of information that we're discussing, or
Sure.
especially if it's like concern type meeting too, and they're like, nervous or anxious. Like, I don't really know what I'm going to get in this. I don't really know how I'm going to, how they're going to receive me, what I'm going to be walking into. But a lot of like 1 hour scheduled meetings. And then the end result of the 1 hour scheduled meeting is like, we now have to schedule another meeting to go through more, leading to sometimes leading to more anxiety. So this year again has just been, it's been very different. And I think if I could propose something practically for the teams, um, is one, getting that communication out for the school teams, getting that communication out early to parents. And I know sometimes it does happen. And I've had some of my parents that are like, oh my gosh, I didn't see the email. I, missed it. It was an oversight. You know what I mean? Like, went in my spam, whatever. But sometimes there's kind of this assumption of just like, this is the annual, so we're going to check our boxes. And I always tell my families, like, that's why we send letters ahead of time, because we're very upfront about, okay, I recognize this is the annual, and that's why I tell my parents that the annual, the school's got boxes they got to check. They have to go through all these pieces to be in state compliance. And so we send our letter to say, hey, realize you got this annual, but I also have these concerns. Do we have enough time to handle both? And I've seen where meetings were split into two, like they came back and were like, hey, we're going to do a part one and a part two. At the end of the part one, we're going to schedule part two. And I've seen ones where they come back and they're like, okay, so you guys available for 2 hours instead of 1 hour. And we think we'll be able to tackle it all in there. And so, that would be something that I would say practically for school teams, is just to look at, how you're scheduling out. And I think too, some of my teams where we do have to do multiple ones is because I'm brought in. I heard an advocate today, and he mentioned how if we have a meeting for 90 minutes, he's like, for 75 of them, I'm asking questions. And because he gets brought into some pretty tough cases, but he was like, because there's often a lack of information, there's a lot of bias, there's a lot of this and that going on, and that's where he's brought in. But the other side of that, I think, too, is that if you're having communication, if you're communicating with your parents and you're letting them know they can have an IEP meeting at any time, and there's been times where that's been said when I was in meetings, and the parent was like, in the 2 years I've been with this school, that is the first time they've ever said that in a meeting, that I can ask for a meeting at any time. And it's usually the district personnel that's saying you can ask for a meeting anytime. So the parent never knew, but it's being said because we've had multiple meetings. And so they're just basically saying, like, some of this we could have tackled like earlier in the year. And it's like, yeah, if that communication was open. So I think in prepping too, as you're wrapping up the school year, think about what went well for you, what went well for your learner. If you're the school team, think about what went well with your case management, your cases, your communication with your families. And, as you prep going into the August timeframe, look at what are some things you want to adjust and how you kind of want to start out the school year on a certain page. And that's where I always say a good meeting at the beginning of the year is beneficial. That's what I do with my kids' teams. I let them know, hey, I'm going to request a meeting in the beginning of the year with all the teachers, all the gen ed teachers, so we can talk about their plan. And so I can know that what's in their plan.
Right. Exactly.
So that's my plan.
We will get into that in more detail this summer. But yes, that is an excellent, excellent piece of advice, is to try to connect with the team pretty early on in the school year to just begin to establish those relationships. And I'll close out with, I love sort of recommending a reflection period of like, what has really worked this year? What have been the hiccups? What doesn't yet feel resolved? And perhaps communicating that to the team prior to the end of the year to say, here's my gratitude around XYZ, and here are ABC questions or concerns I still have, and hope to reach resolution either prior to the end of the school year or very early on in the next school year, just so that you feel like you have some sense of closure.
Yeah, 100%. So that is a wrap, which I can't believe, on season 1 of the Affirming Village podcast. So thank you for joining us. We will see you, as Lisa said, for a nice little 6 truncated season during the summer. No, we don't know what we'll be talking about, but we will be doing that in the summer. And I hope you've listened and I hope you enjoyed, and definitely comment below and let us know what you want to hear about in the summer. That might help give us some ideas.
That would be great. That'd be fantastic. And thank you for being here. And thank you for being such a wonderful co-podcast host, and for having this idea and for inviting me along.
As I told her, I could not have done this with anybody else. And quite honestly, if she wouldn't have done it, I wouldn't have done it because I couldn't do it by myself. So thank you all for listening and watching and being a part of the village.
Absolutely. We'll see you in the summer.
Thank you again for joining us here in the Affirming Village. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff and Lisa Wright, and we hope today's conversation leaves you feeling seen, supported, and better equipped to advocate for yourself or your learner. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this with someone else in the village. Until next time, keep advocating, keep affirming, and keep building the village we all deserve.